Good morning, everyone. My name is Josh Evers, and I am Vice President, Food and Agribusiness, specializing in poultry for Farm Credit Mid-America. We are a financial services cooperative serving 80,000 customers across Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. While the world around us has changed because of the crisis we find ourselves in, we remain focused on securing the future of rural communities and agriculture, one home, one farm, and one business at a time. Thank you for being here today. In times like this, information, especially the right information, is vital to producers who are navigating the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has created. Because we work closely with the poultry producers across our 4 states, we know many of the challenges you are facing today. We have the financial strength to work through these challenges alongside our customers. We also have access to leaders in the poultry industry like those you'll hear from today. We hope today's webinar provides useful information about what's happening in the marketplace and that you'll leave with information that informs decisions you are making. Today we are bringing you 2 experts from Urner Barry to speak to challenges the poultry industry faces. We know this is a very busy time for each of our presenters, and we thank them for taking the time to share their insights and expertise. Before I transition over to our speakers, I want to reiterate that this webinar is intended for the audience on today's call for informational purposes only and is not for public or media consumption. Any opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Farm Credit Mid-America. Let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to Russ Whitman and Brian Moscaguri. Russ is the Senior Vice President for Urner Barry and oversees all of the company's market reporting initiatives. He joined Urner Barry in 1986 and was initially involved with Comtel sales and support. He also served as manager of the Instant Market News Department and coordinated the company's marketing efforts. In addition to his primary market reporting responsibilities, Russ is actively engaged in all facets of Urner Barry's events, services, and media products. He was most recently Vice President of the Poultry Division. He graduated from Washington and Lee University, Lexington, Virginia, with a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration with special attainments in Commerce. Brian Moscaguri is a director at Urner Barry, covering the U.S. and European egg and egg product markets. Brian started working for Urner Barry in May 2011, and in addition to reporting on the egg market, he was named Marketing Director in 2018. He attended Philadelphia University, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies and a Master's in Business Administration. Thank you both for taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Good day, everybody. My name is Russ Whitman. I'm the Senior Vice President of Urner Barry Publications, and I'm happy to be here with my colleague, Brian Moscaguri. And Brian and I are going to be speaking to you this afternoon about, well, poultry and eggs, and of course, the impact that the COVID-19 crisis has had on those markets. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with Urner Barry, but for those of you who are not familiar, Urner Barry is a market reporting firm. We specialize in the commodity end of perishable proteins, and that would include red meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, fats, oils, and edibles, and pretty much everything else that is in that segment. We are a provider of market prices, news, and analysis, along with a host of products that are associated with the food industry. So with that said, I'm really glad that you're able to take some time with us today and learn a little bit more, gain a little bit of insight on the chicken, turkey, and egg market and the impact that COVID-19 has had on them. Whenever I'm putting on a poultry presentation, I almost always start with this slide. For those of you who are not familiar with what a pullet chick is, a pullet chick is the chick that is dedicated to the hatchery supply flock. So these are the guys that are going to be laying the eggs for the broilers that eventually will be slaughtered and consumed as meat by the American consumer and those around the world. As you can see in this chart, and the point that it's trying to make is that for 3 consecutive years, January, February, March, a little stumble in April, and then an explanatory stumble in May, pullet chick hatched has gone up, and it's gone up at a pretty darn steady pace. Now, this isn't necessarily unexpected because in a world where the chicken industry has put 7 to 9 new operations, or at least refurbished operations on the streets, if you will, over the last 2 years, well, they require chickens to run through them. They certainly can't build these plants and then have them sit there idle or even at a 50% capacity. They need chickens. And that's really what this chart is all about. You might notice that in May, there actually looks like we were even with April at 8.2 million head of pullet chicks. And you will also say, well, that was below 2019. In fact, it is on paper. But what happened in 2019 versus 2020 is that there were 2 fewer days of production, fewer work days during the month of May in 2020. So in fact, there was not as much work accomplished and not as many chicks hatched. In fact, if you add those 2 days of production back into the May figures, they would be somewhere around 4 or 5% above last year. And that has been the trend that is a well-established one. So the slide that you see in front of you is USDA chickens egg set. These are the number of eggs that are placed into incubators on a weekly basis, and we use them as a guide, if you will, about the potential for future production. And really, there isn't very much special about this chart until we get into somewhere around February, March of 2020. You'll notice that in the end of August or September, right in that range of 2019, there was a pretty sharp drop in the number of eggs set. But that's very typical. That's a reaction to the upcoming holidays in November and December and the lack of demand, at least retail demand, from the consumer for chicken, and much more slated towards other proteins. So they purposely reduce egg set. But that is not typical what you see, that sharp and precipitous decline that took place in March. That decline is a direct result of COVID-19. And it really has happened for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, they are simply not, they being the chicken industry, is not setting nearly as many eggs as they had been. And the reason for that is they just don't have the personnel to ultimately harvest and process the birds properly. The second reason was the real sharp drop that you see in the immediate beginning of the crisis, if you will, is a result of eggs being broken. And much like the egg industry, where they break eggs for liquid products and so forth and so on, they literally took chicken eggs that were destined to be placed on farms and broke them. There was simply no labor. Again, there was no way to process them from start to finish. There was no demand. Food service needs were just stopping. They went from 100%, or at least a traditional seasonal stance, to almost zero overnight. And this was the immediate response that the chicken industry took in this slide. Our next slide, chick placed, is a natural follow-up to the number of eggs that are set in incubators. The only difference really on a typical fashion would be the 3-week lag time. And what I mean by that is that it takes a chicken egg about 3 weeks in an incubator to hatch. When it turns into a 1-day-old chick, it is then placed on a farm, and that's what this chart is all about. So you'll notice a lot of similarities in the pattern or the flow, if you will, of the chicks placed in relationship to the egg set. You will also notice the most obvious similarity, which is a precipitous drop in the number of chicks placed at the beginning of the crisis. And of course, once labor returned into some sort of normal fashion, you see that real sharp advance again, just like you saw in the egg set. So a direct result of COVID-19, and one that has plagued all of the protein on the production side, is simply the humans available to complete the process. It is an intensive process, particularly when you're dealing with 100 or 200 million chicks or chickens every single week that are coming to slaughter. It's a very monumental task, and this is a clear evidence of how it was impacted during COVID-19. This next chart is the USDA federally inspected slaughter. It is the number of chickens that are crossing the slaughter line each week. And you can see that for the most part, if you back up into March of 2019 and through the summer months, the industry had been more or less oscillating in that 160 million to 170 million head range each week. Now, there were again some real obvious drops that have to do with the holidays of Thanksgiving and Christmas, but then that returns immediately as we get New Year's past us and the industry begins to set its sights on holidays such as Mother's Day that tend to drive consumption, not to mention basketball tournaments and Super Bowls and events that simply were absent for much of the last half of the third quarter, and of course going into Q2. But what this chart shows us is that here too, a lack of labor, inability to run the plants properly. You will recall that on any given day, some of the chicken operations in terms of labor were down 50%. They got away with that for a little bit of time. In other words, slaughter wasn't impacted quite as immediately as one might guess, because there are so many chicken plants around the country that in the beginning, they could literally truck the chickens that were destined for one operation and move them 100 miles or a couple hundred miles the other way and still end up being slaughtered. But eventually, that pipeline really just became full, and that was no longer a really plausible response to the situation. So you can see that as we get over to the right-hand side of this chart, that there has been a more limited amount of head. It dropped all the way down to 150 million for a little bit, bounced back into the 160s, and that seems to be about where we are, taking into account the reductions that we saw back in the egg sets and the chick placed earlier. So if we're going from 170 million head down to 160 million head or so, we're talking that 10% from where we had been, not necessarily 10% on any given week, but 10% cumulatively. Our next chart talks about the average weight. Now, this one is not going to help you understand the impact of COVID-19 on the average weight, as it might help you gain some introspect into the trend that the industry has been having. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the weights in COVID-19. This is a 10-year chart. It goes back to January 2010, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell us, going from lower left, we're talking birds that were routinely being slaughtered, live weights, 5.4 to 5.6 pounds, which have routinely become above 6 pounds somewhere around 2015. You'll see, and I think it'll be obvious to you, that it was a much more static advance in weights in 2011, 2012, 13, and 14, and it just jumped up there in 2015. Now, you will remember what happened in 2015, I think, and that's high-path avian influenza. The chicken industry was non-impacted. The egg industry was majorly impacted, as was the turkey industry. So chicken played a role there that they normally wouldn't necessarily play, and that includes the role that chicken played during that time at the deli counter. So there was a need to advance weights to get that bigger slab of meat to make for a better cooked product. But the difference is it didn't last just for a year or two until the rest of the market caught up and got away from HPAI. It continues, and it continues to this day. That is something very important to keep in mind as we go ahead and we talk about reductions in head count. The weight has not been dropping off. So these reductions in head count that have been recorded are generally not offsetting the ready-to-cook tonnage that is coming out of the chicken industry, despite these reductions that we've been speaking about at the hatch level. Let's move on to our next chart. This is integral to our conversation, and one that I can't emphasize enough. This is a year-to-date head count by size. And generally, if you want to keep it simple, this is small, medium, large, and jumbo chickens. And you can see what the trend has been. And this is not a phenomena to just 2020, by the way. However, it has been exaggerated in 2020. And again, we're going back to labor here. No labor to get the birds off the farms. No labor to process them, even if they did get them off the farms. So those birds were staying out in the field for longer than expected and gaining weight during that time. Again, the trend in the industry has been to much heavier bird weights. It might be the biggest challenge they face, but this is the way it looks through the most current report. We're down 3% on small chickens. We're down 11% on medium-sized chickens. We're up 13% in that large category and 9% in that jumbo category. So you can see that that heavier bird is really the challenge. And even with dramatic reductions in head count, when you're increasing the weight over a proportion that represents 22% of the head that's being slaughtered, that is a very significant factor. And that's exactly what's been happening in the chicken industry. And again, compounded by COVID-19. So what does this all mean when we talk about one of our next favorite topics, and that's cold storage? Chicken cold storage obviously is really what's left over after the initial production process and whatever can't be marketed or disappears into the various retail, consumer, export channels, what have you. So what this shows us is a few things. One, we all know that we've had a lot of chickens that have been coming at the industry, and we know that they've been heavy chickens. We also know that when we speak about heavy chickens, we can't be speaking about one of the most popular whole bird forms, and that's a wog. That's your deli wog, your small bird. Well, we know that there aren't any small birds being produced. So what do they do with the larger birds? They end up in the freezer. Now that's an oversimplified explanation, but there are plenty of whole chickens in the freezer. The second reason for that is simply because when you are in a crisis situation without labor, the most efficient thing to do with that whole chicken is to keep it whole, not take a knife to it, not run it across another line where you have no workers to run that line, but to keep it whole. And of course, one of the byproducts has been no choice but to put excess production into cold storage. Breast and breast meat, very similar situation. Here, even when the process is taking place, the heavy breasts from record high bird weights. The stage that was being set before COVID-19 was one of record production, plain and simple. In December, the chicken industry hit its heaviest weight ever of 6.44, and we just hit that again last month. So in general, there is lots of breast and breast meat. When you cut the legs out from underneath of them, and I don't mean that in leg quarters, what I mean is when you cut food service and it goes from a normal seasonal trend, everybody's out and about, we're all eating our fast food, and so forth, 60 to 70% of the chicken, depending on who you are and what your exposure is consumed in those channels that went away overnight. Again, there was no choice to take the breast and breast meat that you were producing and freeze them short term, because again, these were coming off of big birds. There was lots of tonnage. Leg quarters, big increase. I'm going to go back to what I said about whole chickens here. When you take a chicken, one of the most simple things, if you want to make more than a cut, well, or two, is a leg quarter. You just cut right down the middle of that back half and one back cut off, and all of a sudden you have the back and the leg in your hand, and of course that's a leg quarter. And that's super when you have an export environment, which is an active one. The problem is China and everything that the chicken industry was looking forward to back in 2019 and Q4 2019 and stocked up for, by the way, went into the freezer. That was compounded more recently because, again, without labor, they can only produce so many whole birds. The next most efficient items to cut up are a leg quarter or a front half. And that's exactly what happened. They cut lots of leg quarters without demand for them. Now, I'm going to clarify that for one moment because you're going to see in a chart that prices actually advanced. But the reason that advanced is because in the very beginning of the crisis, when pork and beef were becoming increasingly unavailable at retail, the retailer and the distributor went to chicken, and anything that they could market was hitting the meat case, right? You saw it, you experienced it. Leg quarters in a 4 10-pound bag format works very well at retail. And even processors who do not focus on retail, maybe they were a food service processor, found themselves bagging leg quarters if they could. Anyway, the end result was without exports last year, mediocre ones this year, all suspended by COVID-19, and the extra production because, well, leg quarters are simple to produce, results in increase in inventories of 45%. Wings, this is a bright spot for the chicken industry. Wings have been moving well for months on end. What I mean by that is this is not a story that began in 2020. This is a story that began in 2019 when wing prices were favorable for the major wing houses. They were favorable for the Johnny's Bar and Taverns, who are currently closed down in the major cities around the world and not serving wings. However, the largest distributors and, of course, the people that they provide the wings to, the national chains that we're well aware of, really have had tremendous business success during COVID-19. One or two of them specialize in takeout and delivery from the get-go. They were not a sit-down, watch the TV, have a cold beer type of operation. They were already fully prepared to provide the consumer with wings by delivery or takeout when the crisis hit. On top of that, anybody in that arena quickly adapted and learned to serve the consumer. And while it might have been imperfect, it kept the wing market flowing right along. And then lastly, you'll remember that we are in a headcount reduction with chicken. We're not in a weight reduction, but we're in a headcount reduction. And on every chicken, there are 2 wings. So when you cut those head out, you cut out 10 million a week, you lose 20 million wings. And of course, that's in theory. It's not an exact science, but I'm sure you can understand the point that I'm trying to make. So let's move on to the next chart. And really, I put this in just to remind everybody that's watching this presentation that clearly the impact was not about chicken only. Ground beef, all these consumer channels was majorly impacted. Pork bellies, we stopped eating bacon, on all of our takeout food, all of our food service, all our fast food. And of course, you're going to hear Brian speak very shortly about the egg market. But what you will see is some differences in the follow-up or the follow-up market, if you will, after the immediate impact. You see the upward trending market back in February of just about everything, from eggs to boneless breast, ground beef, wings, and pork belly. Then you saw the precipitous drop once food service dropped out of all of those items. Then for some of the items, you see recovery, and some of those items you do not. And of course, we do not see too much recovery in wings because there wasn't much to recover. They moved along well, just all along. And of course, the egg market, which Brian will speak to about in a little bit. But if you look at boneless breast, if you look at ground beef, and you look at pork belly a la bacon, you see that rebound that was associated with food service starting to open up again. The over response that is typical in any reaction, the overreaction of the market, and then back to more of a moderate scenario right now. So I just like this chart because I think it helps to open our eyes a little bit to the entire protein complex. So what does this mean for prices? We want to spend a little bit of time today speaking about chicken prices. And what this chart, we took 4 of the main items that we've been speaking about during this conversation and took a look at how they have been performing on a price standpoint. Well, you can see all of them are in the red. Jumbo boneless skinless breast, down 10% on a year-to-date basis. Wogs, now this is a 3 to 3.5 pound wog. This is not the small chicken that we were speaking about, or the small chicken necessarily that was favored by certain fast food operations during sandwich wars last year. Jumbo wings, down 17%. That is very favorable for food service. Again, we're talking about record production was the forecast. Record inventories were on hand on January 1st. So even though I told you just a moment ago how well-performing jumbo wings are and why the storage inventories are where they are, a lot of that is driven by price. And leg quarters, these are bulk, fresh, generally large jumbo leg quarters. And again, without export markets, we simply don't consume enough through retail channels. And we haven't been able to take that leg quarter or take that leg and debone it and make leg meat or thigh meat, for instance, because food service hasn't been there to absorb it. And even if food service was there to absorb it, personnel was not there to make that product. So again, across the board, in the face of record inventories coming into the new year, record production in 2019, forecast the same for 2020, and then the ensuing events, this is what our year-to-date price looks like. A little closer inspection of the individual items, and really the purpose of this chart is not to go back multiple years, but so much to see the impact of COVID-19. So really probably what you want to do is focus most of your attention to the right-hand side of the screen. That being said, as a more general statement away from COVID-19, keep in mind what I said about heavier chicken since 2015 over that 6-pound mark, and that steady, obvious increase in headcount that's been going on for well over a decade. And look at the trend you see in boneless, skinless breast since 2017. Forget about those funny lines in 2020, right? There's a very clear and obvious reasons why the boneless, skinless breast market is performing the way that it is. But let's talk about COVID-19. What you see here, of course, that initial drop after December right there, that's nothing to be worried about. That, of course, is holiday influenced withdrawal at retail. That is very typical. We see a rebound after the first. That's a combination of everything from sporting events and playoff season to New Year's resolutions where you're going to eat better, and the consumer still has perception of eating chicken as a lean, high in protein product. And of course, they can easily incorporate that into their nutritional guidelines for them and their families. So, boneless, skinless breast was really positioned well, getting right back into the groove, if you will, and then it hit the wall. And of course, that wall is that second big drop that you see following what happens at the end of every year during the holidays, and it just dropped like a rock. And again, have to remember that I don't have an exact number, but somewhere in that 60% range, I would say better than 60% of all the chicken that's produced out there had been going through food service. And you take 60% of your channels out of that, just because you have retail calling you 10 times a day looking for more product, it doesn't mean you can pack it for retail. So this is the way the chart looks, an obvious impact of COVID-19. And in the next several charts, you're going to see a very similar story. For instance, breast tenders. Now, tenders is a good retail item. It's also an excellent food service item. That goes right up there with wings and cold beer. And again, without all the local bars to be there servicing customers in the major cities, it's not about just big wing houses. It is about all the nooks and crannies that have been shut down. And of course, that is across not only the United States, but across the world. And believe it or not, chicken is consumed in all shapes and forms globally. So, this is a real worldwide event that has impacted every cut there is in the chicken market, and breast tenders is just one of them. Again, please note that on the left-hand side, you see that price trend, upper left to lower right through the last several years, and that goes hand in hand with boneless, skinless breast and production. We can't export that white meat. We can try to export the white meat, but in general, the international community is a consumer of back half items. And then when we move into January, just as a reminder, that drop and that rebound has everything to do with anticipation, NCAA tournament, and everything that goes with that time of year, and then just flattened off completely because it never realized its full potential. This chart is everybody's favorite, jumbo wings. And again, I'm going to start sounding a little bit like a recording, but what has happened here, we'll go back to the favorable price structure. Look at 2019. Look how stable that market was, and it was all well below $1.80 a pound for practical purposes. And that is a number that just about everybody can live with. The numbers that history has proven that the food service industry shies away from is anytime that jumbo wing gets above about $2 a pound. That has happened many times through the years, whether it's a small wing or a jumbo wing, and it just doesn't sit well with their marketing and their fiscal responsibility to their marketing plan. But again, let's fast forward into 2020. Again, typical drop, not unexpected at all. And that rebound and anticipation and during football playoff season. And then, of course, the follow-through anticipation of March Madness, which never developed. And food service just simply wasn't enough to take care of all the wings. Now, again, performance has been admirable. The price is right. Wing inventories are not necessarily the issue as it is price if you're a processor. If you're a buyer, I think you have the best of both worlds going right now with wings. Leg quarters, I think I've made it pretty clear. Now here you will see the one difference with leg quarters is a back half item. It is subject to the whims of the export market. And the whims of the export market, I'm not speaking to China. The chicken industry, keep in mind, has been living without China since 2015. So what you see is a lot less volatility in leg quarters because we have been having that steady outlet channel. But here, again, let's look to the far right of the screen and look into the first quarter, and there was just nothing there to support bulk leg quarters. Now, I want to emphasize bulk leg quarters because if I had chosen to show you a slide of 4 10 packs, which is a retail pack, you would have seen price improvement as those that were able to supply it in that form reap the benefit of it. But generally, when we speak about leg quarters, we talk about jumbo leg quarters, bulk pack, and there just isn't a retail platform that is big enough to support it here in the United States. And with exports, flat might be the right word, or at least suspended as a general statement. There's nowhere for these leg quarters to go. And keep in mind, the reason the export market is flat is because of COVID-19. Right this moment, it seems a little more political when you see some of the political jockeying with the Trump administration. But nevertheless, without the export market, leg quarters cannot really be expected to perform much better than they have been. So here's that 410 I teased you about. Now, here the difference, you see that drop initially, and then you see that rebound really, really strongly. And then again, retail became satiated. Once we got to the point where there was plenty of pork and plenty of beef back to fill the meat case, instead of that random, I'll take it attitude that the buyer had, they became much more selective, and even the demand that 410s had been enjoying went away. So when we talk about factors to consider here too, I'm afraid I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record. When we get into turkey in just a moment, it's all going to sound the same. Let's talk about them. Supply. We came into 2020 with record inventories in many of the key categories, not to mention record production in 2019 with a forecast for record production in 2020. That supply was constricted through a variety of scenarios. We talked about the hatch, we talked about breaking eggs, we talked about labor, but that supply is now coming back. And according to the hatch report, we can only expect as observers to see head slaughter down for another few weeks, because the hatch report tells us that egg sets are starting to go back up again. So supply, it's all about the chicken market right now. Now, of course, demand is too. The second point, demand at food service, demand at fast food, demand at retail, and demand in the export market. They're all about the same thing. They're about COVID-19 and the influence that the consumer has in, or lack of influence really, in what they choose to buy, because they're not choosing. They're being forced to go through channels that maybe they would rather not, and demand has been impacted greatly. You see what's going on around the country with certain states, certain cities seeing a spike again. You see bar closings, you see plans to open restaurants to internal dining going away. And that's all has to do with demand. So clearly COVID-19 is threaded throughout this story. Production in the end, we're talking about head count and bird weights. Keep in mind, COVID-19 was instrumental in taking already heavy birds, propelling them to record average weights almost every week, or at least meeting record average weights. Cold storage is the net result. It goes up, up, and up. As a chicken industry, it's very difficult, as any protein industry, it's very difficult to market from a strong platform when you have a whole freezer full of inventory. And then, of course, the global impact. I don't think I need any real explanation. This is the most serious human health crisis that anybody has been through in our lifetime, and it's not going away anytime soon. It is a global economy. It certainly is a global chicken market. So with that said, we're going to move very quickly on to turkey production, because here the impact was not nearly as noticeable in almost any facet. And the reason for that is because turkey does not have the exposure to food service, fast food, and really consumer foot traffic the way that chicken does. And you're going to see some different trends here. This chart also, we're talking about eggs set, the number of eggs that are going into an incubator. And you will see back in January of 2019, a fairly flat scenario until we got into COVID territory. Right around March, you will see a noted decline in the number of eggs being set for the exact same reasons that you saw for chicken. One of the big differences is here, from the time that egg is set, it has 4 weeks, not 3, to the time that the poult is placed on a farm. And then there's anywhere between, let's call it a 5 to 5.5 month cycle of growth. So that growth cycle, they project all the way into the end of summer. And you can imagine how difficult, instead of looking 42 days down the road like you might for chicken production, you have to take your best stab at what consumer demand might be in the end of summer and adjust accordingly. Of course, this is still all about labor. That is the underlying factor here. And you can see that the egg set have rebounded, but I think what you're going to see in the turkey market going forward, the turkey industry, is more moderation in these sets. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. Poult place, we're going to run through this fairly quickly. I think what I want to bring your eye to really is that switch that you see back in March of 2018, when tom placements started to advance and hen placements started to decline. As a matter of fact, they became juxtaposed in our chart. Now that continues. If we want to speed up and move ourselves into 2020, that trend continues. But what's different about it? Well, what's different about it is that we are not seeing the same levels. While we saw a rebound, for instance, look at the number of poults placed toms, that sharp decline on the right-hand side of your screen, and then it bounced back up. Same thing with hens above it. I mean, that was that whole trend that you see there for the 4 or 5 preceding weeks had everything to do with COVID-19 again. But you'll see that even though they're rebounding and labor is coming back, that they're not rebounding to the same levels. And similarly to the way that the chicken industry has been forced to respond to the consumer, the turkey industry has to do that as well. Our dining habits are changing, and with still a notable absence of fast food and similar that the chicken industry enjoys, and with smaller and smaller families gathering around dinner tables, and with breast meat supplies in abundance, primarily due to heavy toms, cutbacks are the course they appear to be taking in order to bring the house back in order. Let's move on to our next chart. And again, here we are with turkey slaughter. And as I said earlier, this was not immediately impacted anywhere near the way that chicken was. But that being said, you will see a little bit of a stumble in the slaughter figures in that March period for a few weeks. They have rebounded to fairly static levels for the last couple of weeks. And really, the turkey slaughter from here on in is forecasted, if you will, based on the Hatch report, to continue to decline. But in the short term, the reduction that we saw earlier in sets and so forth, we're going to see that later in the summer. So that's not really for today's conversation, but know that that's out of response to the lack of consumer foot traffic at the sub chains where we consume a tremendous amount of white meat. Turkey slaughter looks, similar to the head count on chicken, doesn't it? Nothing but lower left to upper right for the last 10 years. The difference is this is average weight. And I chose this for average weight because this is about the tom side of the turkey market. This is about heavy birds and breast meat that is frankly too plentiful. And that's been proven over and over just by the return on the dollar, return on the investment, the market value that's being realized in recent years. We'll talk about more of that a little later in the dialogue. So what does this mean to turkey cold storage? Well, you heard me say earlier that the hen placements got juxtaposed with toms, and back in 18, they really took a nosedive. Well, that has finally showed up. We are slaughtering. When I say hen poults, that's because the hen poult is the one that tends to go into the bag for whole birds. Whether it's called a tom or a hen, birds up to about 24, 26 pounds in that bag are female in gender. And because of that reduction in placements, sets, and then placements, because of cheap values, low prices cure low prices, right? And that pulls product out of inventory. And to speak about COVID-19 and inventory, turkeys and consumer packaged turkey breast became a great option for the retailer who was looking to satisfy that meat case need. Some of the purchases for the fall holiday needs were actually brought forward and right from the processor, direct to the store. Do not pass go. Do not collect 200. It went right into the store, which is not the usual course. It usually goes from processor to distributor to end user. And they were so needy for protein, the opposite or different scenario developed. It helped cool down inventories in an already robust market. Breasts, 11.6%. Well, you said, Russ, that breast meat just wasn't performing. They have heavy toms. I was really speaking to fresh breast meat. And when we speak about storage, we're talking about frozen breast meat. Well, so it's down 11%, and yet the breast meat market is underperforming. Well, the breast meat market on the frozen side, not fresh, dropped precipitously earlier this year. It lost somewhere in the 40, 50, 60 cent a pound range and became a very attractive option for buyers who were frankly concerned about what they were going to cook. So they decided to go in and buy breast meat at a very opportune time and withdrew all that inventory. So the 11% reduction is not necessarily a result of production or bird weights or an excessive amount of demand, as it is the right price. If you drop below that, we have legs, which are down 5%. When we speak about legs in turkey, that's generally thigh meat. And there too, I mean, it isn't all about great demand. It certainly isn't about great export demand. There was a period where thigh meat was more or less, quote, red hot, unquote. And that was the period when we couldn't get any pork. And our number one export destination for the turkey industry is Mexico. And they were buying quite a bit of thigh meat at the time. That scenario has since changed, but as far as what is in inventory, it's very minimal, 5% below last year. Lastly, MST, 41%. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this crowd on that, but largely that's because of consistent use through consumer channels and then really increasingly through pet food channels, which would be exceptional to the historical norm. We're going to wrap up the conversation a little bit here on turkey with just a quick glance at the numbers. Toms, this is really our frozen whole bird for Thanksgiving, if you will. We happen to choose a 16-pound tom, but this could be an 18 or a 20 or a 22-pound tom. And you can see what has happened with price. Take a look at 2017. No performance, flat line, fair return to the processor, but no performance, too much inventory. And of course, by the end of that season, it was evident what was happening. I believe 2017 was the first year in recent history, anyway, where the market started to decline before Thanksgiving even came to fruition. There was so much supply. It takes a long time to work through whole bird supplies, and that began to take place in late 2018. Of course, price helps to drive it. Look how low that price is. And really the rest is history. We spoke earlier about egg set. We talked about poult placements, reduction in overall birds in the field, and sharp reductions in inventory, coupled with the excess seasonal demand demonstrated by retailers in the need to provide protein for the meat case. Tom breast meat. I think what we're going to do here is draw your attention to the right-hand side. Again, as we said, we had a lot of toms last year. We had a lot of heavy toms, and we had insufficient demand on the streets. Now, breast meat is going, this chart does not do the best job due to the way, I guess, its layout, but we are now in the season for breast meat, and in fact, it's performing pretty admirably. It is at a level that is far below the period from January 2018 all the way through midsummer last year. So that makes it a very affordable option for not only the individual cooking the product, but also for the deli counter, you and me. So turkey breast meat is actually a nice balanced situation. If anything, it's undervalued if you're a turkey processor. But if you're a consumer or a buyer of the meat, you're doing okay. Thigh meat, this is all the same story. Again, precipitous drop, no exports, competition with an abundance of pork. The reason, don't forget ASF, right? The reason that thigh meat looks the way it did or looked the way it did in 2019 was all out of concern for ASF. I mean, my gosh, that topic, that's the first time I've said that this entire conversation because we're just not speaking to it right now. But nevertheless, that ASF backdrop is going to come back later in the year, particularly in the export markets. And perhaps our next discussion will be focused on that again. But nevertheless, in terms of thigh meat, underperforming, valued right for the buyer, and frankly, in a nice balance in conjunction with reduced headcount in the turkey industry as a whole. So just like with chicken, the factors to consider with turkey are identical. I mean, they're probably less severe. And of course, demand is a little less layered. Demand, when we speak about chicken, has everything from fast food all the way down to retail and exports. but we just don't have that fast food, that food service component nearly as large in Turkey. But as far as supply, keep in mind, COVID-19, heavy birds, too much breast meat, not enough participation or foot traffic at our traditional sub chains in the United States. We jump down to cold storage, price and cutbacks at the hatch level as far as whole birds are concerned has really helped cold storage to be at levels that we haven't seen in some time as observers. And then in global impact, just rubber stamp what I said about chicken, and it relates to turkey as well. And then finally today, I have been asked just to speak a little bit about ducks. Now, I want to make sure that you all understand that when we speak to duck, it is a very small industry, a very traditional industry. So there are almost no developments that are eye-opening. Not to mention the fact that the duck industry really only has a few major participants. So we're not getting into any price discussions here, but we are going to look at the publicly available data. And one of the first things we look at is USDA cold storage stocks for frozen ducks. And yes, as you can guess, the demand through traditional Asian markets, all the major cities, all that demand went to zero. Your traditional Peking duck, your traditional Chinese restaurant serving duck, it all went away. Not to mention duck demand at the white glove restaurants all went away. So there was really no choice but for duck producers to put them in storage, which is why you see that sharp escalation in stocks in 2020. Duck slaughter, this looks almost about the opposite. Again, there's almost never a story to tell unless an individual operation has a circumstance. Duck demand is generally very flat at retail, fairly flat at fine dining, and flat's not a bad thing as long as production is in keeping with that. But here you can see what happened with federally inspected slaughter. It dropped like a rock, and that's, of course, because of a lack of labor, the lack of demand, and everything that goes with it. Obviously, the number of ducks crossing the federally inspected slaughter lines declined. And here we're talking about live weights, and similarly, to the way that we have it in all the poultry industry, some of the motivation by processors is certainly driven by feed costs, right? It's a number one component, and feed costs have and are forecast to be, quote, affordable, unquote. So what we have here is a gradual increase in duck weights starting back in January of 2018. We also had weather that was more conducive to growing during that period, less severe winter during 2019. And as a general statement, overall ducks have gone up about 1/10 of a pound. This chart makes it look a little bit more dramatic than it actually is. So with that, I am very thankful for your time this afternoon. We are going to transition over to Brian Muscajuri, who's going to speak to us about the US and the EU egg markets. Brian, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Rush. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I have a lot to cover regarding the egg products markets, especially as it relates to COVID-19. We've seen a lot of things change here over the last 4 or 5 months. It seems like it's been an eternity. So let's get started. Really, in order to understand where the market was prior to COVID, we have to go back a year and we have to look at 2019. This chart shows our Midwest large quotation, which is really the benchmark for the industry in terms of graded prices. The dotted line there is the 10-year average price history. And you can see that 2019 was really disappointing returns for much of the year. The year only averaged just above 95 cents per dozen. And outside of the fourth quarter holiday rally, much of the year was marred by low markets, which were well below average. So the producers were really dealing with disappointing returns last year, and they were coming into 2020 really scratching their heads as far as how they get production in line with demand. And we see this in our layer number chart. You see the rapid recovery from the AI lows back in 15. We see record highs in 2019 when the bird numbers reached over 343 million layers. And then we see 340 plus million layers again in January during those disappointing markets. Coming into 2020, they began to adjust those bird numbers. We saw low markets in the first quarter of 2020, and producers realized they were overproducing. They got to a bottom after adjusting 10 million birds, and then you can see that additional decline post COVID-19, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. But currently, we are at 319.75 million birds, down from 341 million layers, an adjustment of over 20 million birds, which is tremendous when you look at the chart and you think about how many birds have been taken out of the system in the last 6 months. One of the, if not the biggest reasons for the overproduction in the United States has been the conversion to cage-free. There's been so much push from the corporate sector, from individual states, and from the animal rights groups that the producers here in the US have been working on converting their flocks to cage-free. And in some cases, they aren't simply converting, but they're actually adding additional production capacity. And you can see the bird numbers there have more than doubled in the last 3 years. And we now have over 75 million layers in cage-free here in the United States. And we saw this in Europe as well, back in 2012, when they converted from their colony systems and they went into barn systems. They converted from their cage systems and went into colony systems. They did not pull an equal amount of birds out as they made these conversions, and they suffered with very low markets really for the next 5 years. So that's something that we're seeing here in the United States. The producers are trying to reach their cage-free goals in terms of production. And I think based on USDA statistics, the industry is going to need over 230 million layers in cage-free just to fulfill the commitments that were set forth for 2025. So they're well on their way there, but they really struggled while doing these conversions to keep supply in balance with demand and not add additional layers while putting in more cage-free birds. So that was the beginning of the year, right? We see the adjustments in layer numbers. Producers think they're starting to get their supply back in balance. And then we start to deal with these COVID-19 issues. And what COVID-19 created, I would say early in March, was this rush at the supermarket that we would typically see during a regional snowstorm. Whenever you hear of a snowstorm forecasted in a particular area, you see a run at the stores, people flock in, grabbing their essential items, concerned they're not going to get out of the house for a few weeks, milk, bread, toilet paper, and eggs, right? Everyone wants eggs in their refrigerator if they're going to get stuck home. And we saw that not only at a regional level, but on a national level, where people were flocking to these big box stores in particular and loading up on groceries to the point that, you know, the next round of people would go in, they wouldn't find eggs on the shelf. Toilet paper obviously was another hot item that everyone talked about and liked to joke about. But this was really the scene across the country. It started at the box stores. It seems like whenever there's any type of issue where people really want to stock up, they go to the big box stores and they want to buy high quantities of products. And one interesting thing is that a lot of the box stores right now are carrying almost exclusively specialty eggs. So we actually saw a tightening of specialty eggs up front, which actually had a positive impact on the California market before the rest of the industry. And then we started to see this type of scene play out across the country. And to showcase that, we take a look at what that did to price and also what that did to inventory. So that highlighted area there is March, really when the peak rally took place. Our prices went from $1.03 to $3.09. And we saw inventories which were actually beginning to grow heading into what everyone was expecting to be the Easter demand period, rapidly decline way earlier than anyone had expected. And that is actually a decline of more than 10% over 3 straight weeks in the USDA's weekly shell egg inventory. And that was one of the most aggressive, if not the most aggressive, declines in inventory levels that we've ever seen. So producers were actually looking to build their stocks, getting ready for the Easter demand period. And all of a sudden they see this surge demand where their movement was 2 to 3 to 4 to even 6 times what they were expecting. And they literally could not keep up with the demand at retail. So what they had to do was go out into the open market and compete for spot supplies. And that was the reason that we saw prices surge 3 times in just a month's period. And then you started to see the decline, right? So retailers began to put this type of signage at the shelf. Consumers began to run into issues where they literally couldn't find eggs when they went into the stores. Retailers also began to put in limits where you can go into the store and you could buy a dozen or two, but you couldn't buy any more. And that stopped the hoard buying where someone was going in and picking up 6 dozen large and putting them in the refrigerators for a long period of time. And this was some of the signage that the consumer was seeing. But by the time the consumer was beginning to see this signage and the retailer was catching up on price, wholesale levels were already beginning to fall as we started to feel the pinch from the food service sector. And another issue that they were facing was the shortage of cartons. So retailers obviously want their cartons on the shelf. And while food service was falling off a cliff and restaurants were being shut down, school lunch, travel, hotels, leisure, all that stuff was being shut down, those sectors typically take a loose egg or egg product. And that egg that feeds into the egg product sector is typically packed like those eggs that you see on the left, which is a loose pack. What retailers want is their brand name carton with their specs and their Julienne dates and everything else that they've established over the years. And what was available in the market was that loose pack. And the problem with that is the carton availability, which was already tight prior to COVID-19, and the actual capacity on the machines for people to run more eggs into those cartons. So even though eggs were becoming more available and wholesale prices were falling, retailers were still dealing with shortages of the egg in the carton that they wanted. And now the FDA made an exception and said that the retailers could put loose eggs on their shelf. But what we found was retailers didn't really want to deal with that. They didn't want to add an additional SKU. They didn't want to deal with the handling of those loose packs. And they didn't want to get away from those specs of that carton product that they've established over the years. So we actually saw the retailers continue to pursue the carton, which traded at a premium to the rest of the market, even though the rest of the market was rapidly falling. And when you take a look at that adjustment, we went from $3.09 back down to $1.07 during the month of April. And we have kind of continued to slide from those levels down to recently a low of 81 cents per dozen. And that is because, again, we're dealing with the loss of the food service sector, and we'll go into what that loss looks like here in a few slides. But we saw that peak, and we've certainly seen an oversupply of the market due to the continued destruction of the food service sector. Although it has returned slightly, it still is not back at 100%. We saw what the producers did in terms of the supply, right? We saw that additional 10 million birds taken out of lay. Some of that was done through molt, some of that was done through slaughter, so some of those birds have returned. But the producers did what they could on the production side in order to help balance supply with the adjusted demand, even though retail, remains very strong. If you talk to most of the producers right now and you talk about retail demand, you talk to the retail customers and you talk about clearance, eggs are still moving really, really well. And during tough economic conditions like we're seeing right now where there's a lot of job loss, eggs are still one of the most, if not the most, affordable sources of protein. So shell eggs at retail tend to do very, very well during difficult economic conditions. We saw that during the recession. And that's certainly something that we're seeing now as well. On the flip side, the breaker market, we saw go from 25 cents a dozen to 68 cents a dozen at the peak. So we did see a rally, but it was nowhere near the rally that we saw in the shell egg market. And if you go back to the avian flu period, it was actually the breaking stock market that led the surge in the graded market because so many of the birds lost were actually feeding the processing centers. On the flip side of this, in COVID, we actually have most of the demand destruction impacting those that are buying egg products, right? The food service sector. So we saw an early rally of up to 68 cents, and then we really start to see those prices fall apart earlier in March and into April. We saw a low of around 15 cents, and we've recently seen a rebound back up to 33 cents a dozen. So when you think about food service and you're talking about the utilization of eggs in the country, about 1/3 of every shell egg produced is further processed to create egg products. We think about roughly half of that 30% of processed egg is actually making its way into the food service industry, whether that's in liquid or some sort of patty or hard cooked product. And in addition to that, you're talking about 7% of all eggs produced are entering the food service sector in a shell. So when you're talking about 22% of all of the eggs used are destined for food service, and food service is down upwards of 40 to 60%, you're talking about, you know, millions and millions of layers, 60 to 80 million layers that are producing without a home. And that is the reason for that rapid decline in bird numbers and some of the lows that you're going to see here in the egg product sector. Whole egg was the one item that was impacted most. And I think that goes back almost directly to the QSR channel. A lot of the breakfast sandwiches that are served, not only are the QSR channels closed, but so many people are working from home that it creates a real change in the dynamic of the way people consume breakfast, right? People aren't rushing to work in the morning, grabbing a quick bite to go. They're cooking from home more often, and you know, eggs are still an easy way to make breakfast in the morning. And we saw prices of liquid whole egg go from 55 cents all the way down to 8 cents. And in some cases, they were giving liquid whole egg away because there was nowhere to go with the product. Some of these big processors have literally built, you know, millions and millions of bird operations with set contracts to feed some of these big QSR chains. And when their demand goes down 60%, they literally don't have a home for all of that production. So they had to put liquid into the market. They pretty much put it anywhere they can go. And we saw record low prices on our liquid whole egg quote. As we've seen food service begin to recover and we've seen the adjustments on the supply, we've seen prices begin to rebound upwards of 30 cents. The market has been fairly stable here, but again, you can see how much lower the current market conditions are than where we've been over the last 10 years. Another issue that the industry faced was that we had a relatively high dried egg inventory. So you're looking at a dried egg inventory that's upwards of 28 million pounds as we go through the month of February. So this chart only gets through the month of February. This doesn't even take into consideration the amount of liquid that was available into the market and the amount of egg that had to be further processed and put away in dried or frozen stocks during the COVID period. In fact, some processors, you know, we believe got so flush with inventory that they had to stop cooperating with this voluntary report. And the USDA has actually since pulled the dried egg inventory down. We haven't seen a newly published report since February. But going in at those highs, at that 28 plus million pound level, prior to the demand destruction, you'd have to think we were easily over 30 million pounds of inventory in this country, if not setting record high levels of inventory. And that's evident in our dry quotes. However, the one thing to remember is that the market has been overproduced really for the last 2 years, right? I showed you 2019. When markets are overproduced, processors take advantage of that cheap raw material and they stock that product away. And we've actually seen all of our dried quotes, whole egg, yolk, and whites, at 52-week lows or lower for the last year and a half. We've seen slight dips off of the lows of 2019, but for the most part, processors have been able to at least hold their asking prices because they were already near rock bottom levels throughout much of the country. And if they are unable to get at least these levels here in the United States, at least in the yellow categories, they've been able to find export partners, particularly in Europe, in the yolk category and some whole egg as well. They've been able to move some egg white into Japan. However, we are not very competitive in the global egg white market. And that's because we have a different demand dynamic than the rest of the world does, where this health and wellness trend that you see here in the United States, these egg white breakfast sandwiches, these protein snacks that use egg white as the protein source, it's not as popular in the rest of the country. And those retail items, like those protein snacks, have also done very, very well. And that's helped to support the dried egg market, at least the dried white market, at levels above $4 a pound, even though we've seen slight dips there more recently. So what were processors forced to do, and what stat can we look at to see how they made those adjustments? Well, the best stat that we can kind of take account for is the cases broken number that comes out weekly by the USDA. We actually see that cases broken number falling 30% from where it was early in the year due to COVID and due to the lack of food service demand. So processors simply stopped breaking eggs. In some cases, they were diverting more eggs into the shell egg arena, and in other cases, they put birds in molt to stop production as rapidly as possible. Now you could again see that rebound. Those are birds returning from molt, and that's also the food service sector beginning to come back here across the country as the states begin to open up and you have outdoor dining and people get more comfortable getting deliveries and whatnot from different restaurants and food service organizations. Exports, really not too much to talk about there, other than the fact that they've generally hung in close to 10-year average levels. And I think this has more to do with how cheap our prices were, how much inventory the producers and processors put behind them, and how aggressive some of the processors were getting with countries like Europe that were taking advantage of some of those lows and some of those inventories. So at the very least, processors were able to alleviate some of the surplus into international markets. But in years where we see prices as low as they are now and the current availability, we would typically see these export markets grow. But this issue, as Russ mentioned, is a global issue, and it's something that all countries are dealing with. So the food service sector has certainly been impacted across the world. But going back to the way consumers use food service, in Europe, eggs are used more at home. They're used for baking. They cook a lot more. They don't go out for fast food breakfasts as much as they do here in the United States. So the impact on the egg industry in Europe was much less pronounced than it was here in the United States. So there was still a similar demand for finished product, and the US thankfully was able to take advantage of that during some of the low points. So as far as California is concerned and legislation across the US, the only legislation that we're really watching is more cage-free legislation. California is going to be all cage-free as of 2022. Colorado and Michigan and Oregon and other states are also still pushing towards their cage-free legislation. We expect more states to follow the same. California did implement their first phase of California's Proposition 12 back in January of 2020. Many people thought it was going to mimic what we saw back when Proposition 2 went into effect, which was back in 2015. We did see spreads between California and the Midwest open up a bit, opening to about 50 cents, but it was nowhere near that $2 plus spread that we saw during the Proposition 2 movement. And I think that has everything to do with the amount of cage-free layers that were already in production in the states versus back in 2015, where you didn't have those California Proposition 2 layers geared up and ready to go. So as far as legislation is concerned, we really haven't seen anything in the egg market, at least, that has been impacted by COVID. And we're really focused on how this continued cage-free movement is pushed not only by the corporations, but also by the individual states. So what we're watching for as we go forward, we're looking at additional shutdowns due to COVID. Obviously, right now in the news, you're hearing about surging cases across the country and people scaling back plans for reopening states and in-room dining, capacity, etc. Travel, huge issue. What happens when we go back to school, right? What does school lunch look like? Are people going to be lining up at buffet lines? Are things going to be more in grab and go? You know, what does that hospitality sector look like? Obviously, economic conditions are not great, but that still could be good for the egg industry, particularly at retail. Long-term changes in consumer trends. So you hear that after 45 days of doing something, it becomes habitual. Well, that could be the case in terms of consumer trends. Consumers are itching to go back out, but they've also spent a lot of time at home learning how to cook, learning how to make easy meals, learning how to use eggs at home, buying more products from retailers, getting more delivery at home. Are we going to see normal trends or post-COVID trends become normal again in this country? It'll be interesting to watch. Production recovery and cage-free. Obviously, we see the rapid decline in production. They need to continue to put in cage-free layers in order to hit 2025 goals. So it's going to be interesting to see how they balance the recovery from their recent adjustment with demand and add cage-free at the same time. We certainly could see a rapid recovery in production if they continue to produce conventional eggs and want to expand into cage-free. The egg carton supply is something that we're really watching right now. We've heard things as interesting as some packers going out to Brazil and Europe looking for cartons because they can't get what they need here domestically. Retailers have also been a little bit timid about running aggressive features even with markets at current lows because they're unsure if they can get their packers to put eggs in a carton for them if they want to bump their volumes. And then obviously consolidation, we've seen that across retail, we've seen that across producers with markets dealing with some of the issues that they saw in 2019 and now here in 2020. We'd expect continued consolidation as some of these companies deal with unprecedented circumstances. With that, I just want to mention that Urner Barry's executive conference will be hosted online this year. It will be October 6th through the 9th. And if you guys are interested in seeing presentations on poultry, eggs, seafood, red meat, you can get more info at urnerbarry.com/events. I highly recommend it. You guys can take advantage from the comfort of your own homes, just like you are doing right now. And for questions, please feel free to contact Russ or myself. Our emails are up on the screen, and we'd be more than happy to supply you with additional information or any data that you need to support the presentation. Thank you guys very much for having us again. Russ, thanks for joining us. And hopefully we've answered a lot of your questions. And if you need anything from us at Urner Barry, please feel free to reach out.
Thanks again to both of you for joining us and sharing your expertise and insights. Thank you to all of our customers, team members, and industry advocates and supporters for carving out time to be here as well. In times like these, we encourage all producers to speak with their lender early and often. We encourage you to continue to reach out to us and work with us to find solutions for your challenges and needs. If you have additional questions or would like to get in touch to discuss options and ways Farm Credit Mid-America can support you and your operation, we encourage you to reach out to us. It's been a pleasure to host you, and please know that our thoughts and best wishes are with each of you and your families today and throughout the coming weeks. Best wishes to all of you, and we hope to speak with you soon.